Yep, we're on. Welcome everyone to the New Zealand Schools Debating Championship Round 4 debate between Northland and Wellington Gold on the motion, this House believes that the New Zealand government should adopt a policy of always calling out China rather than seeking to appease or maintain positive relations. So without further ado, I would invite the first affirmative speaker to begin today's debate.
When we see China exploiting the economies of small countries like Sri Lanka and Ethiopia, when we see them exploiting the human rights of their own citizens, we see that this is not a system that New Zealand should support. Today, we will prove to you why, by calling out China rather than seeking to appease positive relationships, we actually strengthen New Zealand's economy and preserve New Zealand's sovereignty and democracy. Today, we'll be bringing to you a model where the New Zealand government would publicise abuse occurring in China, international bodies would step in, such as the United Nations, to hold China accountable for their actions. In this debate, we see China as unique from other large economies, such as India and America, due to their single-party state, and due to their history where they have been known to accelerate debt trap diplomacy in smaller countries. On our side of the house, we support human rights, and on our side of the house, we support New Zealand remaining an independent country.
On that point?
The points we'll be bringing to you today, is our principle, firstly, why we have the duty to speak out, and then our substantives, firstly, how we prevent New Zealand's sovereignty, protect New Zealand's sovereignty and democracy. Secondly, how we better preserve New Zealand's economy. And our split will be how we prevent economic exploitation. Why do we have the duty to speak out? Firstly, when we see minorities in China, such as Muslims, being put in concentration camps and forced to eat pork and things like that, this is a system that New Zealand does not want to stand for. As a democracy, we believe that New Zealand should care about this because we, as a democracy, we value human rights such as freedom of speech, the right to vote, and the right to not be discriminated against based on the value of ethnicity. Yes?
Do you think any of the things you just described will get better if New Zealand actually calls out China?
As I'll be explaining in my substantives, we do actually think it will get better because we think that right now there is no anything being demanded from China to change their views. And we think that when we put our country in a position where we're actually demanding change, it's China will be forced to make some extent of a sacrifice. So even if it is a minimal move, a positive move, we still see there's going to be somewhat of a benefit. And we think that's extremely important. So I think that it's extremely important to speak out and protect these other countries and to prevent it from, as democratic country, and to protect it from getting to New Zealand shores. On to our first point about how we protect New Zealand's sovereignty and democracy. What we see happening right now is we see countries such as Sri Lanka and Ethiopia, where the Chinese government has gone over main sectors of their economy. They've brought in a lot of money, like their ports, and gotten a lot of put a lot of these countries into massive debts and things where they now have to pay back the Chinese government huge amounts of loans. We see that the same trend has moved to more Western countries like Greece, where they got the Greece government into massive amounts of debt, and Greece is now in the same position of paying back massive loans to the Chinese government and is now under more under influence by the Chinese government. And then we see these same detrimental trends moving to neighbouring countries like Australia, and we think that at this point, it's about where do we stop? And we think that New Zealand, it's really important for New Zealand to make draw the line. No. So what do we think will change by calling out China? Firstly, New Zealand government will not be influenced by Chinese governments or officials. Why is this going to happen? Because when the New Zealand government publicises the Chinese views and things like that, this pushes the government parties who are the government will develop regulations and policies against taking Chinese funds and against being under influence from China. And so this isn't going to happen anymore. yeah, so they're not going to be under any influence, especially because when it's publicised, that the New Zealand public is now holding like the New Zealand government to this like higher standard, and so the New Zealand government is like forced to be held accountable. Secondly, we see that like we reduce the influence of China in New Zealand, because when like we see that New Zealand, like China get a lot of benefit from local New Zealand businesses, because we give like a lot of like Chinese we export a lot of products to China, and like so they really don't want to like lose money and things. So New Zealand businesses have an influence over China. We recognise that, and that will reduce the influence of China in New Zealand by like, if to a certain extent, like New Zealand businesses would start pulling out of China and things if they didn't change their policies, even after we'd already called them out.
On that point.
No, and so then we see outcomes of this, like firstly, like when we speak out to the public, we see that there's now like a massive public, like when the New Zealand government is speaking out against it, there's now like massive public pressure, and like
On that point,
on like China's government to make changes, and to change. Yeah. So secondly, how do we better preserve New Zealand's economy? Firstly, we see that we already have very strong alliances with countries such as like the United States and the Europe and like other countries in the European Union, which are still like bigger industries. So we think that like, firstly, we don't think that China's going to pull out because New Zealand already benefits China through like our primary industries such as dairy and meat. But even if they do, we're still in a position to like,
on that point,
because by not supporting these systems, like we'll strengthen our alliances with the EU and USA. So what changes when we call out China and our economy? Firstly, with like what we see already happening is that in a lot of countries where China steps in and takes businesses to, they often bring in like their own Chinese laborers, which means there isn't much work for like the actual like local population, like there isn't local employment. And so when we call out China on like injustices like this, when we call out China on like injustices such as this, it means that we put a pressure on China to bring in more like New Zealand employment. And so we said like now when we put that pressure on them, China's no longer going to like solely be bringing in Chinese laborers for these projects. We're going to have like somewhat of employment from New Zealand citizens if they do bring projects to New Zealand. Because like once we demand change, like China has to make somewhat of a like, has to concede somewhat, so they can't just like keep their same regiment. And so we'll get more employment from New Zealand citizens. And then secondly, we see that we strengthen like the economic alliance with countries such as India and America, and then like countries in the EU, because we see that these are also like large democratic countries, and that these democratic countries will support each other, and that like because they have a lot of economic incentives. For example, like America doesn't want businesses to be taken over by China. They're going to like push and like make sure that New Zealand and things like hold China accountable, and we make sure that because we improve New Zealand's economy and relationship with China within our own country if projects do come here, and because we protect New Zealand's sovereignty, we are proud to affirm.
We thank the speaker for her speech. Judges, if you can just let me know when you're ready, and then we'll invite the first negative speaker.
I feel like that charge is really dodgy.
Yeah.
I'm gonna trip and die. Oh, wait, I'm muted.
Am I muted? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
When the proposition came out and told you that when Jacinda Ardern criticizes China at a press conference, the most powerful totalitarian country in the world will completely reassess their human rights issues, they failed to understand a fundamental truth in today's debate, which is that realistically, New Zealand is a flea on China's back. In this debate today, our burden to prove is that the moot creates no change while also creating tangible harms to the average New Zealander, which we can't stand for today. Okay, what do we stand for? So, like, we agree in this debate that there are issues with China and like the human rights issues, but we don't think that there is any way New Zealand can change that. We would rather that we continue to deal with China through trade. We think that like probably there are going to be individuals in New Zealand who are going to like work with like Amnesty International and stuff. That's fine. We're fine with like New Zealand like working collaboratively with other nations on issues surrounding China, but we don't think that we have a moral obligation to take on the world's burden, which is China's issues today. I will be bringing three main arguments. Firstly, why China's behaviour will continue. Secondly, why there are significant tangible harms to New Zealand. And thirdly, we'll be bringing a split about how this harms domestic activism in China. Firstly, I'd like to address some of the opposing team's arguments. First of all, the principal point. We think that this is fine, but we didn't see any mechanisms provided of how there would be actual tangible change created. We don't want to risk the harms that we're going to prove today without any change created, which I'll explain in my substantive. We think that, as they said, China is a single party state. We don't think that they're likely to make any change, as I will further address in my substantive. The first substantive was about like our democracy and sovereignty. So we think that like currently, if the government like just completely stops trading with China, right, we don't think that there's going to be this massive public mood about not wanting to have anything to do with China. We think the government is accountable to people that they like, to the people that vote them in. We think that like people are going to want to vote in a government that supports China if they don't have jobs. When they don't have a job that supports China, we don't think there's going to be any like realistic change in like the government or anything. Okay, and on the economy point, they said that we could just move to other markets. There's a few reasons why this isn't true. Firstly, we currently have a massive reliance on China. They're 80% of our trade. We're not in a position to switch to other markets like the US, as they suggested, like in terms of our dairy market and stuff. America produce their own dairy. They don't have a massive demand for ours. So it's simply not true that we can just move to other markets. That doesn't stand today. Okay, firstly onto my first substantive, why calling out China does not change China's behaviour. So in this point, I'm going to discuss a couple of reasons why, even if like the mood is implemented, we're not going to make a proper change. We think that the premise of the proposition relies on being able to prove that China makes changes when they call them out, and we think that like this realistically doesn't happen, so they cannot claim the benefits of any of these human rights issues being solved. A couple reasons for this. Firstly, New Zealand doesn't have much political capital. So New Zealand and China are not on an equal footing in terms of like diplomatic and trade relations. So China is like arguably the most powerful country in the world. They don't rely really heavily on our trade. While conversely, we're like a relatively small country and we rely on China. Like that, we have like $14 billion of trade a year with China. 80% of our trade relies solely on that market. We rely on them. So what happens when we call them out? China gets like pretty pissed off, right? They're going to be really angry that we're calling them out on a global stage, embarrassed. We think that what's going to happen is that they're going to stop trading with us and that we're going to end trade deals. We think that they have the power to look elsewhere, which we don't have, as I've already explained, because there's not a demand for our goods in other places. We think that they have the ability to like buy their dairy from Australia. We don't think that they have to make a change because they can just go other places. So what happens so what do we see happening? We see that there is no change to China's behavior. Secondly, we don't actually have enough power to set a global precedent in New Zealand. Right, in order to make change, a global trend would have to start. Why can't this happen? Firstly, other countries would just see China like stop trading with us and not want to speak up. They wouldn't want to be like us. They wouldn't want to lose all their trade benefits. And this means that China's behavior will continue. Secondly, like it's important to recognize that China is so powerful that other countries rely on China too. They're like a major trade partner for everyone. Everyone wants to trade with them and not prepared, and then not going to be prepared to like take the hit that we as New Zealand will be like preparing ourselves to take. So secondly, we're not going to start a global trend, which would be required for change to happen. Thirdly, China doesn't have any incentive to stop their behavior because they can simply move to other markets if someone stands up to them. We actually saw America, which is like arguably the second most powerful country in the world, actually stand up to them. And we saw China make no change, right? So America stopped like selling soybeans to China, and China just moved to prop up the Brazilian soybean industry because they can afford to do that because they have that kind of political and economic capital. Okay, so if small countries see America doing that and like not getting any results, no one is likely to follow this trend that New Zealand would be making in this debate. So China would have no incentive to trade because they could move to other markets. And what do we see? At the end of this point, we see that China's behavior has continued. Okay, at the end of this point, we have proved to you that they cannot claim any of the benefits that they have proposed on the opposing side about like fixing China's human rights issues, because there is literally no incentive for China to change because we do not matter to them as much as they matter to us. Okay, so we have disproved like the major premise of the proposition, which is
On that point,
I'll accept it.
When China commits horrible crimes on human rights and New Zealand stays silent when we have and support a democracy, what kind of message does that send to the New Zealand population and our allied countries?
Right, well, we think that like we don't have to come out and like stand by like what China's doing, right? But we think, as we've just proved to you, there will be literally no change if we take that action. China will change nothing. They have no incentive. That does not stand. Okay, secondly, onto my second substantive, why there will be tangible harms to New Zealand. And at this point, I'll discuss what actually happens when we have no change and when we take this action anyway. So we think that there's going to be no change made and massive harms, and what we care about today is protecting New Zealand as a whole. Okay, firstly, this will bring massive harms to our economic relationship, right? So most of Chinese businesses, or like a really like big proportion, like state-owned businesses. So when we annoy the government, all of those massive businesses are going to stop trading with us. So what does this mean? This means a few things. Firstly, the average New Zealander just like can't get like major Chinese goods, right? So we can't get like maybe Huawei phones, we can't get cheap goods, we can't even probably have TikTok, right? So that just makes life more inconvenient. This is like a harm for just the everyday New Zealander. But secondly, a really major harm is that like 90% of our dairy exports go to China, right? So when we like stop trading with China, we have farmers out of jobs. We think that the top people at like corporate frontier are going to be fine. The people we're talking about is the small farmers, right, who maybe work on a family farm, who like lose their entire livelihood. They don't have any other skill set, right? We think that these people are who we care about today, and we can't see them lose their livelihood in order for making like no change on the other side of the house. We can't accept this harm today. Okay, so what do we see then? We see that life is like just less convenient for the everyday New Zealander. We have people out of jobs, people we care about today, like just out of employment, and everyday New Zealander just can't get the goods they had before. Things are more expensive. This is like bad, and we don't stand for this today. Secondly, there's going to be harms to our socio-diplomatic relationship with China, right? So we think that citizens in China are going to like react when we like call out. They're going to think like, oh my gosh, everyone in New Zealand hates us, thinks we're like racist, which like broadly just isn't true, right? So we think that we're also going to lose out on our second biggest industry, which is tourism, because the major part of our tourism market are Chinese tourists. They also, not only do they come to New Zealand quite a lot, but also while they're here, they do like big spending, right? And so we think that this means that small businesses in New Zealand also lose out when we remove our first and second biggest industry. This is another massive hit to our economy, which we can't accept today. And this is really unnecessary because of the harms it will cause to everyday New Zealanders. So what do we know at the end of this point? New Zealand individuals have no right to suffer majorly, but like some sort of principled moral obligation that is not our duty to make, that will make absolutely zero change to anything as a whole and will only cause harm to New Zealanders. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for her speech, and if the adjudicators are ready, would now invite the second affirmative speaker to continue their team's case.
When the opposition came up here today and told us that Jacinda condemning China's human rights abuses would mean that China would pull every single import that they profit from coming into New Zealand consumers, coming into New Zealand's local market, we think that is a massively ridiculous claim, and that completely subverts their own case, right? That China responds first and foremost to monetary incentives, because China will not pull out of New Zealand's economy 100%. No, they will not ban all their imports that are massively profitable, that they do gain lots of consumer revenue from coming into New Zealand. That is a ridiculous claim. Two main points of clash for today, also including a smaller principal clash on a lot of unresponded to material in terms of protecting sovereignty, as well as the point of clash on who best maintains economic benefits. And then thirdly, will this action actually produce change in China's behavior, followed by a split point on how we prevent economic exploitation. So beginning with this point of clash on the economic damage towards China, right? Because they told us at second that we provided no mechanisms to change China's behavior. This is completely wrong, because we brought you at first, one, that China wants to maintain their soft power by retaining friendly relations with governments, and often does actually change their behavior to adjust to this. Secondly, the direct monetary incentive on China to actually maintain their financial investments within New Zealand and throughout all of these countries. And thirdly, all this relations of labor relations and consumers and businesses that will adjust their responses to China when the government stands against various abuses. So we say there literally no incentive spiel is completely wrong.
On that point.
They also brought us this idea that simultaneously they have a massive inclusion of New Zealand exports, right? Because this is a massive contradiction inside their case. At once they told us that they rely heavily on New Zealand exports, and a lot of New Zealand exports go towards China, but they also told us that we're a flea on their back and that they can pretty much be unopposed if they sacrifice all of their exports. They also said that we're not going to start a global trend. And we think this is kind of dishonest, because there already is a trend beginning, right? Because governments in the Philippines and Indonesia have condemned Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea, right?
On that point.
We need a Western government to actually legitimize all these movements that are already started, that these Western governments are too cowardly to actually stand behind. When they told us about this massive economic damage that will totally destroy New Zealand's economy, right? We think that this is based on the incorrect premise that every single Chinese company is going to leave New Zealand and no more imports are going to come in. They told us it's impossible to move to other markets. They told us that we have 80% of exports going to China. No, it's actually more around 20 to 30%. But even so, first of all, China would not pull out of New Zealand's economy. Why is this? They have valuable investments and are directly incentivized to keep gaining profit in the New Zealand economy. New Zealand products are still attractive to Chinese private consumers. And we see that countries in Western Europe that have criticized China in the past, but they still have trade relations intact, because it is an economic necessity for China to continue trading with all of these countries. But we say even if China exited, we have two main alternatives. Firstly, we told you that the EU and the USA are both separately larger economies than China by themselves. And our trade with these blocs would be strengthened, because we'd have stronger diplomatic relations, we'd have market spaces for these businesses to move into. We also told you that India, Thailand, Indonesia, and all these other countries are rapidly industrializing, and they have disagreements and conflicts with China and hold anti-China geopolitical positions. All of their growth rates of these countries are greater than China's. And as China's economic growth rate slows and stagnates, it is perhaps more vital to build strong economic ties with these rising countries rather than China, which is starting to slow down and stagnate. And we would prioritize going with these rising and developing democracies rather than China's economy, which will actually be a smaller share than these more rapidly growing economies. But we say that even if these ties cannot substitute for China, consumers worldwide will still buy important exports like beef and dairy products. We still have investors attracted to New Zealand businesses, land, and real estate. And it's not just Chinese state-owned enterprises. We also see the rising profile of other New Zealand exports in the Western world. And there's a large proportion of New Zealand economy that is composed of the internal service sector, which is not dependent on Chinese state-owned enterprises. Even so, China only composes around 30% of our exports by value. Now, will this actually produce change? And I'll address this a lot in my substantive point, but just to go over some things quickly. First of all, their alternative is we get literally nothing, right? They literally said that, okay, some New Zealanders might go into Amnesty International and do whatever they want, but they pretty much gave us no alternative
On that
for
point,
how actually to pressurize China to actually make some changes, because they acknowledged that this country is a massively totalitarian government, and then they went straight on to say it's not our responsibility to do anything about it. We think this is a massive moral failure on their side of the house, and their failure to provide any alternative is a massive contradiction inside their case.
on
But we
that
also
point,
see that when China took advantage of Ghanaian resources, there were labor strikes that occurred, and Ghanaian government officials actually condemned Chinese state-owned enterprise influence. And they were joined by other countries like Nigeria. And we saw as a result, China was actually pressured to maintain its investments, and it went and forgave Ghana's debt and integrated Ghanaian local labor at 50% of their foreign firms. 50% were made to be local laborers. If these small developing countries were actually able to provoke readjustment by challenging China's soft power and also challenging their financial investments, we see that New Zealand can also provoke a readjustment just as well as these small developing countries. But finally, let's look at the comparative on their side of the house, right? Because when these countries and New Zealand literally demand nothing of China, don't even put forward any criticisms of China's foreign economic exploitation, we get literally no improvement. On our side of the house, at the smallest, we put forward some criticisms of this economic exploitation, and we may provoke a small policy response, or larger, we have an actual financial impact on China, and they do really change their policy behavior. I'll take a point now. I'll take a point of information.
you gave the example that places like the Philippines are starting to call out China, and we have seen no tangible change from there. Why would that not, the example that you gave, still exist when New Zealand made that call for change instead?
First of all, we think that these countries like Philippines definitely need backing from international bodies like the United Nations and from Western countries with a lot of legitimacy like China. More than that, these countries were often isolated, and as I'm about to say in my split point, it's very important to overcome this isolation, so every country that can and is in position to must challenge China's monopoly over these countries. So how do we prevent economic exploitation on our side of the house? We see through a network of imperialistic trade deals and debt trap diplomacy, Chinese corporations extract natural resources and exploit local labor by subverting self-governance and democracy. We saw them taking over Sri Lankan ports because the Sri Lankan government could not actually put forward a challenge to China and did not speak out early enough. How do we fix this on the outside of the house? One, we see that on their side of the house, countries are intimidated by isolation. By speaking out alone, developing countries are actually afraid to face repercussions from China. But having New Zealand stand up for them enables countries, particularly in the Pacific, which is very important for Chinese influence, to be able to actually open their grievances. Secondly, we see that as more countries call out China, there's more leverage to place pressure on China to change human rights abuses and subversion of sovereignty. A united front of developing countries, Western nations, and international diplomatic bodies could wield enough economic power and influence to catalyze change. We see that countries like the Philippines have already started speaking out against Chinese expansionism, but they do need this support from these Western countries, and they do need these actual economic relations to challenge them and challenge their soft power. That's why speaking out and actually having financial changes are both direct incentives acting on China to change their behavior. Thank you very much.
We thank the speaker for his speech, and if the adjudicators are ready, we'll invite the second negative speaker to continue their team's case.
It's funny how when the affirmative team gave examples where people called out China, all of them led to no change. China has not changed its ways and how it has labor issues. It has not changed in how it hurts ethnic minorities. And we do not think it's going to do the same to a small country like New Zealand, who has no political influence and no global influence at all. This is why we are proud to stand by what not calling out China today. 3 points of rebuttal I am going to bring to you. First, I'm going to talk about how China politically act when they're called out. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the economics effects of when China is called out by New Zealand. And then finally, I'm going to address the argument on what happens when switching trading partners and how that's not effective in this debate. Then I'll get onto my split point on how this harms domestic activism. Now, onto my first point on how China politically act when called out. So we clearly told you at the start of this debate that we agree that it is bad that China has problems with their Belt and Road Initiative Act and how they harm countries with their debt traps. We know that they have problems with their human rights issues, but we also understand that at the end of the day, we want to protect the lifestyles of New Zealand citizens, just like every other country does, and that we can't take effective action by ourselves, and we don't expect it to come with a global scale like the UN until future years. We're not ready for this at this scale at the moment. So what do we actually think will happen when they get called out? They said that like China will magically change their ways and actually take action and responsibility for their problems and change the way they think. But we told you clearly at first that NZ have little political capital, which means that when we call them out, yes, sure, China will get embarrassed on a global media scale, but then it will be gone away with a week or so. We don't think it will change there. But secondly, we lack global precedent to actually get a big activism march towards China in the way they behave. So what happens, it will be only us acting out and we will get the punishment and they will retaliate against us and only us. We see two effects of this. First, countries are going to see that China are retaliating against us by reducing trade because we called them out and they don't like being called out. We have seen this with their hostility to people within their own nation speaking out about anti-government stuff. But also we secondly think that because these other countries also rely on China for trade, they're not going to pull out of this because they know that they will get retaliated against too. Now, let's talk under this point about this possibility that first gave to us about how China has like political power over New Zealand government and how they're going to take over New Zealand. We think, first of all, that there is no incentive to have complete power over New Zealand. This is because we have a bad geographic position to have any military bases in like they did with Sri Lanka, but we also think that we have generally a weak military. We don't have much global political power, so we're just generally not a country that they want too much influence over. We're not needed by China. They already have their power elsewhere. We're just a tool for trade. But secondly, we think that even if they do like they propose, we think we have the UN and their allies to protect us in this case. And that even on their side as the Affirmative team, they do not stop China from attempting to take over our country on their side, and that China will only retaliate against us. So what actually happens on their side is that you get no change. We've seen this with movements in the South China Sea, which didn't lead to anything. In fact, it's been happening for 20 years, and there's still aggression in the China Sea from China, who's been trying to take over the small islands like Vietnam and the Philippines. And we've seen this in the American trade war, which in their split point, they talked about how Western nations can help take this action. If a country like America, who is the powerhouse Western nation, can't have effective action in terms of trade, in their trade war, then how do we expect change? I will take you there.
When politicians in Ghana scared China into composing 50% of corporate employees of local people to maintain their friendly relations, do you think those politicians should not have spoken up?
Look, we think that China doesn't actually care about one. What we actually think happens to them is that these politicians speak up and they're probably more oppressed because of it. We think that China will actually be hostile to people within their own nation, but speaking against Guana, which I will talk about later in my split point. So we still think they're going to have their labor issues. We still think there's going to be problems on the side. And we actually think they help in making China retaliate against them, which I will get in my split. So secondly, how China economically act. So they've told us that China won't pull out 100% of trade. They think that China still need us. When we clearly told you at first that China have trade across all of the world and they don't need New Zealand, for example, when we only provide them small goods like dairy and honey. Those are our two main exports. We get a lot from China, they get a little from us. What we told you, and they failed to understand, is that China can just find alternatives. They can go to Australia for dairy instead, which is just slightly worse than New Zealand, but will still fit up with their demand. We've seen this when they did it to America. When America no longer gave them soybeans, they just went to Brazil instead. It may have been not as good quality soybeans, but they still got the demand. So So China find alternatives and we lose out in this debate. But even then, if China only pulled out with like 10% of trade, we still think it's going to be a huge hit to the New Zealand economy, because Fonterra is one of our biggest in exports and imports. And we think that people are going to lose jobs. We think we lose innovation and technology, and overall we have a great hit. So what happens in this debate is we lose trade, we lose tourism, and overall we just don't have a positive relationship with China. So they're going to be more hostile to us. We've seen this in how they treat people within their own nation. We've seen this in their hostility in the China Sea. It stays the same. So finally, let's quickly address how like NZ can switch trading partners. We clearly told you that we are geographically further away from countries like the US. So if we traded with them, it'd be pricier trade, so that's not effective. But secondly, with China, we have similar trading partners. For example, we have the Australia and Chinese collaboration project that we have going on. We don't get this with countries like America and Russia. But then again, there's this case that with America, they can produce their own dairy. It's not in demand from there where it is from China. So therefore, our main trade resources are not needed by other countries like Russia, like America, like the UK. And this has been seen overall. But finally, we think that a reason for this, and this won't happen, is because China does the most mass production in the world. They have a bigger country, they have more people, and they have more resources. And this is shown in how China makes computers and technology cheaper than the US, and therefore people buy from that because they have more resources. So other countries can't keep up in terms of trade. Finally, let's talk about my split point on how this harms domestic activism. We think this is important because the AF claims to help people, but they're just harming them. Why does this happen? First, we think that China is going to blame their own people for exposing human rights issues within their nation. We think that they're going to think that the domestic reporters told countries like New Zealand what China was really like, and then they're actually going to be worse on them and they're going to start spreading more propaganda, have heavier internet restrictions, and are going to lock up more reporters because they have become more aware and alert and need to protect themselves because they think that they're getting aggression from the rest of the world. So what they actually do more is they suppress their people more under the side of F. That was what happens. We stay consistent, but they actually hurt the Chinese people more, and they don't even address their own domestic issues. But also they generally become hypersensitive. So what this means again is that they're going to have more aggression towards the Chinese people. So overall, in this debate, what we do is we protect the average New Zealand citizen by ensuring they have a good source of trade and a lifestyle, but we also ensure that people within China are protected from the government and their hostility. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for her speech, and if the adjudicators are ready, would now invite the third affirmative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of their team's case.
Today, when the negating team came out here and they didn't give us any alternative to how we were going to combat, the progressiveness and the, horrible things that China are doing, they gave us no alternative. The only response for change was to do nothing, because in their world, us standing against something is nothing and it doesn't matter. So therefore, we shouldn't try and do anything. Today, we have three main points of clash. The first being who better protects the New Zealand economy. The second being who achieves better outcomes for New Zealand citizens. And the third is who achieves better global change. So on to the first point about who protects New Zealand's economy. So on their side of the house, they said that New Zealand would have nothing, there's no pressure to change on their side. No. So what we've heard from side negating today about how the New Zealand economy, they basically said that if we stand against China and we stand against, the policies and the, horrible acts against humanity, and when we speak out about it, that, China is going to become embarrassed and they're going to pull all this stuff from New Zealand and they're not going to cooperate, and therefore we're going to lose so much of our imports, etc., and how our economy is going to basically crash because apparently no one else views New Zealand's products as beneficial. So I have two responses to that. So first of all, we have proven to you today why China isn't likely to just run away if we stand up against the things like that. So first response to that, no. First response was we told you that they rely a lot on our goods. Even side negating team came out here today and said that we supply 80 to 90% of their dairy industries and the exports from us, right? That is a large amount. They rely on us heavily for that thing, so they're not likely to just jump away. And no, the second response to that is that New Zealand purchases many of their products as well, so they also have revenue there. Even if they do pull out, we have told you, there's three responses to this today. We have told you that one, there are other countries such as India and Indonesia where they're developing it at a quick rate and they have similar democracy views to us. We told you that this has a platform for us to then sell our goods to them, so that we have other alternatives because things like America, etc. And then second of this, that kind of leads off of that, is that New Zealand is very well known to having a good reputation for good quality and clean milk and meat products that expands it's much further reaching than just China. We have a big reputation of having good products. It's not like nobody is going to purchase our stuff. I think that's unrealistic for them to say that if China's not going to buy our milk, no one will, and then we'll completely crash. The third point I'd like to bring out is that the dairy industry isn't the only industry in New Zealand that is quite big and creates a lot of revenue. So the tourism industry is also quite big, which I'll touch more on further in my second point of clash. So this is the reason why we don't think New Zealand is going to completely crash if China does pull out. And also we've told you why we don't think it's actually that realistic that China is going to pull out that much. So that is why we believe
that point.
We have proven to you today why we on our side of the house don't actually get this massive economical collapse like the negating team are trying to push. Yes, I'll take a POI.
Do you recognize that our highest number of tourists are from China?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I just didn't hear it.
Majority of our tourists come from China. Do you understand that?
Yes, right. Well, I want to touch on that right now. So that brings me to the second point of clash about who gets better outcomes for New Zealand. So the negating team have come out here and that POI, they just said that, New Zealand tourism, it's massive from China, etc. They basically told us that if New Zealand stands against that, crimes against humanity that the Chinese government are inflicting on their citizens, that all the Chinese people in China are going to think, everyone hates us in New Zealand, we're not going to go there, and we're going to stop and boycott New Zealand completely. I have two responses for you today about that. Now, right now we've had our borders closed in New Zealand, and it's actually, we've had this generated the same amount, even more, just from New Zealand's internal travel, right? We've actually generated a lot of revenue just from New Zealand travel, which goes to show that we don't have to rely on on China strictly for our tourism industry, because that's not true. The second response is that New Zealand is a hit for holidays. We have amazing beaches and forests and spectacular views and etc. From Australia, from Europe, from America, from so many countries come to New Zealand on tourism. That it's not realistic to say that just because China, apparently all Chinese people will think we hate them, that they're then going to not come to China. So that is why we don't actually believe that the harm of tourism actually has that much sway or strength to stand on. The second they told us about these things was like the little farmers are going to lose their jobs because we don't have any export companies. But as I told you earlier, we don't think this is likely that they will lose their job. Regardless of that, they also told us that the main people that supply China's things are the big companies like Frontier and etc. So even if, apparently China's going to pull out and, it's going to collapse our milk industry, like the negating team are trying to tell you today, it's going to be Frontier and things like that. They're going to have the hardest hit, even though we don't think that is going to happen, not the smaller farmers. And even if the smaller farmers, a lot of the times they supply like local milk as well. Like they supply local milk to like New Zealanders as well, and like I told you, will majority be able to attract other people into helping. So on to the third point about who better achieves global change. So today we basically heard from the negating team that New Zealand is not big enough to take a stand against China and that nothing will happen if we speak against it. However, several responses to you today. At second, we gave you an example of countries like Nigeria that, actually took a stand against China, and they actually scared them into forgiving a lot of their debt and composing 50% of their corporate workforce from local people. So we think that is change, right? That they did get something out of it and it was positive and it did benefit to them, right? So we don't think it's actually achievable for them to say that there's no examples of when people have stood up against it and have generated change. A second point that I'd like to bring up is why we think countries would stand with us. I think that other countries who also have democracies would like stand with us because China kind of like goes directly against that, and also like our allies. We also told you that countries like America, which have much more hostile relations with China, don't obviously want China to be leading in a lot of manufacturing companies, because then they lose out on that revenue and things. So that is why we believe we'll have like the support of other countries that can band with us. And even if we only get a small change, and even if all we're doing is telling the New Zealand public and New Zealand citizens that we stand for democracy and we are willing to stand by the ideas behind it, and that we're not willing to just let crimes against humanity go unnoticed, we believe that that is a beneficial message to send to the world, and that is why we are proud to affirm.
We thank the speaker for her speech, and if the judges are ready, would invite the third negative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of today's debate.
In today's debate, the negating team has a massive burden to prove, and that the F has to prove that taking a massive, enormous hit to the New Zealand economy is going to produce change. We don't think that they've been able to do either of those things. We think that proving that there has been change has been very difficult for the affirmative team in today's debate, and we think that considering the economic harms that we have brought time and time again, that they are not going to be able to prove that this is something that the New Zealand government needs to do. Because the comparative in today's debate is not between a principled case that calls out negative behavior and an economic case. It's literally the comparative between taking an action that is at best ineffective and at worst actually genuinely really harmful, or just continuing as we are and continuing to like create actual change, continuing to help domestic fights against these human rights abuses, and continuing to actually do something. We think that we are the only house that does that, and we think that the affirmative team has failed to hit that very high burden in today's debate. Two key points of clash to deal with. First of all, why is New Zealand genuinely just like so much worse off when we call out China, talking about their economy, our tourism, and our sovereignty? And then secondly, why China's human rights abuses are just improved when we don't call them out. So on this first point of clash, the affirmative team has to accept in today's debate that if we call out China, there is going to be a massive hit to New Zealand. I'm going to talk about that a little later in my speech. We've heard it time and time again, and we've heard next to no responses. They need to, in order to win this debate, prove that this harm is justified because we call out China. So why, they need to prove that we call out China. But so let's look at this massive hit to New Zealand. What does it actually look like? Because the true factor of the economy is that yes, we think China will pull out of trade. We think that they have an incentive to, we don't think that the incentive to stay in New Zealand is sufficient enough, right? Even if they make profit from New Zealand, two responses here. First of all, we think the amount of profit that they make in New Zealand, they could easily just make elsewhere, somewhere like Brazil, as we saw during the US-China trade war. But secondly, we think literally there are thousands of people in China locked up right now who could be working. Clearly, China has a political incentive that they prioritize over their economic incentive. We think that if New Zealand calls them out, if New Zealand offends them, that political incentive is likely to take precedent, and they are going to take that economic hit to politically stand against New Zealand. So we think that they will continue to pull out. Right, but let's be super charitable. Even at the affirmative team's best, we think that a 10% hit to the New Zealand economy is still so significant, right? We think that the kinds of people that it hits are not the massive people at the top of Fonterra. It's these small farmers that Fonterra employs who have little plots of land in Marlborough, who their parents have had that land, their grandparents have had that land, and these are people who are highly trained, who are highly specialized, who are literally losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods, and losing their income. We think that it's really offensive that the affirmative team tells us that those people don't matter, or that they're just small farmers, because we think these are genuine people in New Zealand who are losing out, who are having these massive harms done to them for what we see is essentially no gain. We think that at the point in time where the affirmative team decided that small farmers don't matter, they lost today's debate. But let's say China switches trade, let's say China stops trading with us. Why can New Zealand not then just switch trade partners? We've told you, and we've given you analysis about this all throughout the debate. We think it's been pretty much ignored, and we think that's quite a shame. But essentially, we told you that because of China's population, that we can't get that same type of trade anywhere else. We told you that because places like America and the EU produce their own dairy, they don't have an incentive to import ours. And we also heard at Sophie, which went unresponded to, that because of geographic position, we have the ability to make multilateral trades with China, with Australia, and with similar countries. And that means that we have significantly better trades with China than anywhere else. We think that even if we can switch trade partners, there is still a massive economic harm. All right, then on tourism next, we've heard that New Zealand doesn't need Chinese people to have tourists, or that even if we do, China's tourists will still come. First of all, we think that during the coronavirus pandemic, it's completely false to say that New Zealand's making the same amount of money. That's why we have wage subsidies for people who literally aren't making any money, particularly in the tourism industry. But secondly, we think that when you tell all Chinese, every Chinese person, that they are a Uyghur abusing horrible person, they're going to not want to come to New Zealand. They're going to go to Scandinavia, which also has really pretty fields and flower fields and waterfalls and stuff, right? We don't think that they're going to continue to come to New Zealand, and we think that even if we take the affirmative team at their best, if 10% of those Chinese tourists stop coming to New Zealand, that is a significant harm to our vulnerable people, to the people who live promoting our beautiful country, and we think that we cannot stand for that. Finally, on sovereignty, we don't think there is any reason why China would threaten New Zealand's sovereignty if we did this. We actually think that on the converse, when New Zealand calls out China, China has more of an incentive to clamp down on New Zealand, to shut that up, and they will have more of an incentive to come and take over us and invade our sovereignty. At the end of this point, at the affirmative team's best, they have proven that there is a 10% harm to our economy and a 10% harm to tourism. That is massive. That is jobs. That is livelihoods. We don't think we can stand for that, right? But actually, we think that that harm goes much further than 10%, and we think that there is a significant, a very high detriment to New Zealand. In order to win this debate, they then have to prove that that massive economic hit is actually worth it because we get outcomes. So why then do we not get outcomes? Moving on to my second point of clash here about why China's human rights abuses are just not improved when we call people out. Now, the plain matter and the plain fact in today's debate is that China just does not care about New Zealand. We came out at first and told you that we do not have sufficient political capital to make them actually care. We think the fact that we are a rich country compared to Sri Lanka doesn't actually make a difference, because yes, while we might be rich, we're still not willing to take that 10% hit to our economy. We still think that the government is beholden to its voters, who vote not on principles, but on whether or not their farm is being taken over and whether or not they're being kicked off of their land that their family has owned for hundreds of years. We think that at the end of the day, the government in New Zealand, and the people of New Zealand get more change when we allow China, when we don't directly confront China. Because what happens is that New Zealand takes that massive hit, and China has no incentive to change, because we have the affirmative team today has been unable to prove that we had significant pressure on China, and that's really what they needed to do. It's quite a shame they weren't able to do that, because we don't think that it's realistic to say that China is just going to roll over and be like, oh no, New Zealand and the Philippines and Sri Lanka or whatever said that we need to stop trading, we're going to stop trading. We think that more likely these are the kinds of countries that lock people up in concentration camps. They're just going to completely ignore us and decide that they don't care what the rest of the world thinks. They're still doing what they want to do. Right? So we think that we see no change from New Zealand because we don't have enough political capital. But even if we did, right, even if we take the affirmative team at the best and say we did, even if we get no change, or even if we get some change, actually what they do is they harm domestic fighting against the regime. They harm the kinds of people that Sophie talked about in her split and that went unresponded to, who work within China to promote the Me Too movement, to promote movements against an autocratic regime. And we think that when we draw attention to those people, when we put them in the spotlight, China clamps down on those people, China locks those people in concentration camps, and those people are unable to make change. Even if at the end of today's debate there are no economic harms, we think that at their best, the affirmative team still continues to hurt people in their human rights in China, and we think that we can't stand for that. To win this debate, the AF had to prove that this massive hit to New Zealand's economy that still exists was worth it because we would get change. We think that that hit still is very, very prominent and is still the most important thing in the debate, but we also think that it's not worth it because they don't get any human rights improvements at the end of the day anyway.
He thanked the speaker for her speech, and now, as is customary, we would reverse the speaking order and invite the leader of the negative team to conclude their team's case in today's debate.
The trade-off in today's debate, right from the start, was between a massive economic hit for New Zealand in exchange for literally zero direct positive change for China. The affirming team had to prove that this hit was worth it for the change, and they have fundamentally failed to do that in today's debate, and this is why we have won the debate today. Okay, 2 key points of clash. Firstly, what will be the economic impact of this, and secondly, what will be the political impact for China for this. On this first point of what will happen to the New Zealand economy. So we told you right from the start, we supplied mechanisms to you for why China is going to want to stop trading with us. We told you that while we are a relatively minor part of their economy for them, they are a major part for us. They are a primary partner. We are not theirs. That is why they have that ability to leave. We do not have that same ability. Okay, secondly then, why can't we just go to other markets? We told you that China is unique in its demand for our major products, for our dairy, for our tourism. We told you that other countries, like the examples they supplied, like America, don't have that same ability to trade because of things like geographic position and also just plain and simple demand. So we know from that we cannot leave China. We cannot just stop, China will stop trading with us, and that is a hit that we cannot accept because we do not have anywhere else to go. Okay, then the next issue. What is the impact of this on New Zealanders? Okay, so we told you that we're going to have less available goods in New Zealand. This wasn't addressed. We then told you about the hit that's going to happen to dairy farmers. Okay, the opposing team has not addressed this. They have not told us what they're going to do to all these people who are going to lose their livelihoods, right? We told you right from first that these are the people that we care about. We care about New Zealanders, and we think that we can't don't have the moral burden for this. And when they didn't care about them, they also lost today's debate. Okay, we also told you that our second biggest industry, we wouldn't have a fallback industry because of tourism, right? So when we came out and told you at first and at second that we would not have this tourism, this massive spending for our small businesses, which we need so much in our economy, right? They came out and said that we have as much revenue from domestic tourism, which wasn't true. They failed to address this point about tourism, and that is why they lost the economic hit point today. We've won this. This is why we won today's debate. Secondly, there was this point on sovereignty. We told you at third that like there's no incentive. Like there's no incentive to like take our sovereignty when we have a positive trade relationship with China. However, there is that political incentive to like take more of our sovereignty, like when we start calling them out, and like there's that political incentive which we think acts more on China than an economic incentive when it comes to New Zealand. So we think that sovereignty is actually way more at risk under the opposing side of the house, which is what we told you today. So that's why we won the point of what will happen to New Zealand's economy. Okay, secondly, here's the premise of the opposing team's case. Will China make proper, like tangible political change? This is what they had to prove today, and this is also what they failed to prove. The examples they provided were actually like pretty not analogous, as we've told you. So they told you that there was like the Philippines was like starting to make a change. Well, we actually came up and said to you at second, and we've seen no change. Why would it be any different? There were no mechanisms provided for why we would be any different. Then they talked about Western nations needing to make change, but we'd actually come out at first and had told you that America had literally stopped trading with China and they just went to other markets. We asked you why this would be different for New Zealand. No analogy, no analysis provided. We know that this incentive would be the same, and like we would not get change under their side of the house. Okay, so we know that China has no political incentive to listen to us because they do not rely on us economically. But again, even because of our insufficient political capital, so we know that they won't make change. But again, even if, as my third speaker said, we take them at their best and like they have some political incentive to make change, all they will do was harm their domestic activists. So even at their best, there are still people harmed on their side of the house. They have failed to prove that the economic hit is worth it for this change, which they've also failed to prove will take place today. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for her speech and would now invite the leader of the Affirmative team to conclude today's debate.
Negating side of the house, when they completely ignored examples such as Ghana and Nigeria, where speaking out caused massive change within those countries, we think they completely ignored the realistic outcome and power that speaking out has. They would have, on the negating side of the house, they would have New Zealand compromise its values for, at best, minimum economic benefits. On our side of the house, we come down to two main points of clash. Firstly, does speaking out actually initiate change in China's behaviour? And secondly, who better protects New Zealand's economy? On to that first point. On the negating side of the house, on their side, they would have absolutely no change occur, like no attempts at change happen. On their side of the house, they said that we'd somehow be making it more detrimental situation for Chinese people who are trying to protest, because now they're going to be in the spotlight and somehow China's government's just going to like lock them up in concentration camps. But what we have brought to you down the line is that firstly, when we bring attention to the situation, these individuals within that country are now going to have more international support. They're going to have people not only within China like supporting them, they're going to have people like overseas who hear about New Zealand's like publicizing of Chinese behavior, like now supporting like those people within the countries. So they're actually going to get more support. When we gave you examples, as I previously stated, in Ghana and Nigeria, where they were able to scare Chinese government into forgiving their debt and like now composing 50% of corporate workforce from local people, we see that then, like when we gave you this example at second, and we saw no actual response to this other than like just refusal to say that it actually happened. We think that like this is like very good evidence to say that like if New Zealand spoke out, we could at least make a change within New Zealand, where even if like Chinese businesses and companies came to New Zealand, we could now get them more employment for New Zealand people and like comprised of like Chinese workers. And so therefore on our side of the house, we believe like a change can actually happen. Whereas on their side, they'll just have you do nothing and like just let the situation get more and more detrimental until New Zealand becomes harmed as well. On to the second point about who better protects New Zealand's economy. The Affirmative team said that for us to win the debate, we had to accept that there is a massive economic damage and justify why this damage is justified. But what we've brought to you throughout the line is evidence and analysis on why this economic damage isn't going to happen. Firstly, when we brought to you that China isn't going to pull out of New Zealand because we supply 70% of their dairy, of the primary imports. When we brought to you that New Zealand actually exports more to China than we import from China. We said that even if China pulled out, we still have the support of our allies, such as America and countries in the United Union. We brought to you that there's developing industries, such as in India and things like that, that we could invest in, so that we won't actually get this massive economic damage that the Wellington team have tried to characterize massively. When they said that. They also brought to us about this massive harm to dairy farmers and tourism industries. But as we brought to you at second and third, this isn't going to happen. Firstly, a lot of these local farmers and local businesses and things like that try to characterize there being a massive harm to. We told you, realistically, most of these local businesses, they're not the businesses supplying to massive countries like China. They're the businesses supplying to communities around them. They're the businesses supplying to New Zealand companies at most, but it's the massive companies like Fonterra who are actually supplying to China. So there isn't this massive harm that they tried to make out on their side as well. And therefore we believe that they lost that point. In tourism, as we said, they also brought up this idea of how somehow Chinese people are going to be offended and therefore not come to New Zealand. But when New Zealand takes a stand and supports them and supports their rights, we think that it actually is we've brought to you that this would actually be better for New Zealand economy and tourism. So therefore, because we get better outcomes for New Zealand's economy and realistic, and we actually spark change, we are therefore proud to affirm.
We thank the speaker for her speech. Well done, everyone, for a good debate.